Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. So we're in the middle of the story of God and Abraham finalizing this covenant, and God is promising Abraham a great nation, which includes a lot of people and descendants, especially the generations that will come, as well as land in the future. And so far, he doesn't have either of those, and he's already 99 years old, and we'll learn how old his wife is relatively now in just a minute. So in Genesis 17:15, it says, "Then God said to Abraham, 'As for your wife, you must no longer call her Sarai. Sarah will be her name. I will bless her and give you a son through her. I will bless her, and she will become a mother of nations. King of countries will come from her.' Then Abraham bowed down with his face to the ground and laughed as he said to himself, 'Can a son be born to a man who's 100 years old? Can Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And so, pausing for a second at the end of 17, we see that Abraham was 99, it says, but Abraham says he was 100. So he could have been in his 99th year, basically going on 100. You kind of round up at that point. But also, some may suggest that it was a metaphorical number. And we can see that Sarah is 90, so she's approximately 10 years younger, 9, give or take. And so they weren't incredibly far off in age, especially considering when you're older, it doesn't really matter much. And especially back in those days, age mattered even less than it does now. And as I was mentioning, it's possible that 99 and 190 could be symbolic numbers for meaning that they're getting to the end of the age where they would have the ability to produce children. And Abraham is obviously skeptical, and he's just asking questions to God because he doesn't think it could or would, or even, as we'll find out, maybe even thinks that it shouldn't happen. And maybe there's reasons that him and Sarah could think or feel that way. But let's keep on reading in verse 18. Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." God said, "No. Sarah, your wife, is going to bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as a perpetual covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. I will indeed bless him, make him fruitful, and give him a multitude of descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this set time next year." When he finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. So we can see that this is the end of the conversation and the time with him and God. So is Abraham circumcised now because that was the sign? Did he go ahead and do it while they were speaking? And Well, he was present as a way to confirm things in front of God. Well, God was still with him. And again, was God there in person, or was he there in spirit? I don't know exactly, but we're going to read a story in just several verses as we start chapter 18 soon, after we have one more episode in between talking about what happens between God confirming and setting up this covenant and when the next event in Abraham's life begins. But let's talk about it. We've already talked about almost every concept that we've had here, but I want to emphasize and bring out just a few points. So, first, God continues talking to Abraham after all the things they've talked about already. And he said that he wasn't supposed to call his wife by her name Sarai anymore. He was supposed to start calling her Sarah now. Let's talk about Sarah's name. In Hebrew, it means my princess. And we have Abram's old name. It was essentially great father. So we have the great father and we have my princess, or essentially his princess. And so he was, this great father of the house, and he was supposed to be, the big man of the family, and she's his queen, his princess. And so that's a great family story and all, but God is talking about making them a great nation, not just a nice little family where, he's this great, wonderful father of, a nice size family, and she's the queen, but then they die off and their heritage is left to a servant in the family. Obviously, that wasn't God's ideal plan for them. He was trying to get them to have kids this whole time, because as we read on, it's pretty clear when God's saying things like, I will bless her, meaning Sarah, and give her a son, and I will bless her, and she will be a mother of nations. So essentially, the name change from Sarai to Sarah is just like Abraham's, where it turns into a plural meaning many. So essentially, she is not just going to be Abraham's princess. She's going to be the queen or princess of many. So the term princess actually comes from prince, which prince means king, leader, chief, essentially the head of a people group and even a country or a nation. And so we can see in several places of the Bible, instead of opting to use the word king, it instead uses the term for prince, which is essentially a synonym back then, just a different type, kind of like we have presidents and prime ministers. And in the same way, even though the government might be a little different from place to place, it's essentially pretty much the same thing. And so we have the feminine form of the word for prince, which would be princess. And then the morphing, the Sarai, the I at the end, infers that it's my, so it's my princess. And then when you change that I to an ah, that's where you get that pluralized form. So we have it even spell out the name change and exactly what it means in verse 16 when he says that he'll bless her and she'll become the mother of nations. So he's saying that she's not even going to just be the mother of one nation anymore. She's going to be the mother of nations. So even just her one son, who we find out his name is going to be Isaac, which we'll talk about in a second. This is pretty important, and it says king of countries will come from her. So, she's the queen or princess, so she's the lady ruler in one sense of this dynasty that is about to begin. And that makes Abraham obviously the prince or the king of many future nations that are going to come from their line. And we know that there were many kings that did come from Sarah, obviously. We had the nation of Israel, but even Israel split into Judah and Israel. But as time went on, they splintered and they were assimilated into many different people groups and nations through history, and we can see that today. So God wasn't lying when he promised these things to Sarah. And so then the story turns and Abraham bows down again with his face to the ground, which he was doing earlier. And this time, instead, he's actually laughing. And so I don't know to what extent he was finding these things funny and laughing. I don't know if it was him cracking up or him just giggling and a little confused and, like, what do you mean I'm going to have another kid? Like, probably Hagar was quite a bit younger. And plus, it's been 10 years since he had a kid with Hagar. So he's a little older, Sarah's a little older, and he doesn't completely doubt God, but he's questioning him at the very least. And it would be kind of funny, especially if God was physically showing up and asking these questions. But even if he wasn't, it would be at least still a little ironic and seem a little silly or funny if God was speaking to your heart and asked you to do something that seemed practically unreasonable. Like, Abraham, I know that you're 99 going on 100, but your wife, who's only 10 years younger and also 90 years old, you guys are going to have a kid by this time next year, it says. And it specifically mentions that in verse 21. So he does ask two questions while he's laughing or giggling. First is if he can have a kid, or how could he if he's basically going on 100. And the second and even more difficult part is his wife is the one who has to get pregnant and bear the kid, and she has to be able to originally conceive. And who knows if she had already began going through menopause, because it is possible still to be pregnant while you're in menopause, but obviously the chances and the risk become much more heightened. And of course, nowadays, someone would have been long gone. But again, were things different back then? There's a high chance, because it suggests, or was it a flat out miracle? She had already had menopause several years back, and it already ended, and she had, for all intents and purposes, no chance, but God did a miracle and allowed her and helped her to get pregnant anyways. I am not 100% because it doesn't say. However, obviously, just as we're finding it hard to believe, so was Abraham. And so Abraham not only thought that that was a little out there for God to ask, but he also was thinking about his son Ishmael, because his son Ishmael was already 13, 14, almost years old, because it says that Abram was 86 years old when he had the kid, and now he's 99, so 13 years later, exactly, if the years are spot on in the story. And so essentially, Abraham's spent the last 13 years of his life making plans for, probably, and assuming that Ishmael was that promise and blessing that God gave him. And of course, Ishmael and every child God gives us is a blessing, and we should take care of every child that God allows us to get pregnant with and give birth to. However, this wasn't the one that he was putting his stamp of approval and blessing on. He still promised Hagar and Ishmael that they would be great and that there would be a lot of descendants that would come from them. Yet, it specifically emphasizes that God was going to bless and give his stamp of approval to his and Sarah's child. And their child, again, is going to be Isaac. And Isaac is the one that it says, as we read on in verse 19, it says that when she bears a son and they name him Isaac, he'll confirm his covenant with that child. And so, even though God allowed Ishmael to be born, and he gave Hagar a blessing by providing her a son, and he gave Abraham some relief by having a child around for some time, even though it wasn't under the best circumstances, he still allowed the blessing of Ishmael to be, and he still, since it came from Abraham, and since Ishmael was a child that God loved and wanted to prosper and succeed, he does him a great people. And we see that today in the ethnicity of the Arabs. We can see even in verse 20, God does acknowledge something that already took place when he's telling Abraham, don't worry, as for Ishmael, I've heard you and I will bless him. So here we do see there is a blessing for Ishmael, and it is that he's going to be fruitful and have many descendants. And we already talked about that many descendants, but God does love his other son, Ishmael. It's just when we go back to verse 19 that he's not making the covenant that they've been talking about with Ishmael. And I think that that's important for those studying religion and for those who are people of faith, because who did God make a covenant and promise with, it was with Israel, not with Ishmael. And essentially, Isaac turns into Ishmael. So, in one sense, even though there is more heatedness than we could ever talk about, and we could never touch on all of the issues between the Israelites and the Arabs, at least according to the scriptures of the God of Abraham. The main fact and point to get is that the scriptures talking about Abraham that are trusted and proven and true say that the covenant is going to come through Isaac down through the Israelites. And so we read exactly that in 19, it says he'll confirm the covenant with Isaac as a perpetual covenant. Now, this gets into really sticky ground because let's just have an honest conversation right now. So, obviously, Israelites and Christians say that the scripture, according to the Bible, the Torah, which is the original writings, that they've been preserved and they're trustworthy, and they have the account which later people end up, including the Muslims, build upon anyways. And so the Muslims, I know, claim that they also believe in the same story of Abraham, but they have a different version. And so why exactly are there altered versions? Obviously, the story happened some distance between when it happened and when it was written. At the same time, they believe in the same story. And Islam, I know, also does believe that the stories of Scripture are true, that the prophets were as well. And the difficulty also is where it talks about this perpetual covenant. Is it true that it's an everlasting covenant that will last forever, that only the people who have faith in the God who promised to Isaac this covenant, only people who believe through this line or are adopted into the family of Israel, you could say, will be able to come into the family of God and have a covenant with Him? Honestly, there's only two options or things I could say. Either number one, it is supposed to last forever and it's continued down and on to Christians and those who believe in the one true God and that He sent His Son and came as the Son at the same time to save us, and anyone who believes and trusts in Him and His message will end up being saved. Or there is also, you could maybe say, an interpretation, as we've talked about, where perpetual or continual or eternal or everlasting technically doesn't always mean eternal, and it could mean continuous up until a certain point where you can't, at least right now, see. And so did that come to an end when Muhammad came on the scene, and as an Arab and as an Ishmaelite essentially told people that this was all a lie and that, his people are the ones who God is making a covenant with? Honestly, even though I don't think most people talk about it in this kind of way, I think this is where the entire battle is fought, because they're fighting both for land and they're fighting over which of the people or which of the brothers is the greatest. Is it Isaac and the Israelites, or is it Ishmael and the Arabs? And this battle of the sons is still raging on to this day. And so I believe that it's a much bigger jump in the dark to believe a lot of the things about Muhammad's life and the things that are taught through Islam. And I have read through the Quran to learn about some of the things that it says and teaches. And of course, I'm not an expert on it, but yet just learning that and some of the history, it makes me definitely concerned. And so with this podcast, I'm not trying to start up any fights. I'm trying to talk about the reality of what the Hebrew scriptures is talking about. And technically, without Abraham and these scriptures that were recorded by Moses, and even the Arabs and Islam also attests to Moses very highly as well. And since he was the one who recorded these things, and we can prove that they haven't been altered from the core of what was originally there, although there's been a lot of different versions of essentially the same thing that have come through time, we should be able to trust what Moses and the scribes and prophets had written about Abraham. And so we finish off with a few things. I wanted to emphasize in verse 20, it talks about God hearing Abraham, because it's a great point. Abraham's asking, why not Ishmael? Like, he's been around, you gave me him. He is already getting closer to that age where, if I do pass away, he could take over as long as he has someone to watch over him and help him to rise up and grow into the role. But then we do read, and he essentially not only gives him a great nation and a large amount of descendants and people, which we know that there is many Arabs on the earth today. It also says that he'll make him into a great nation, and not just one country or nation, but it says that he'll become the father of 12 princes. And remember, princes are essentially leaders, kings. And so who are these 12 princes going to be? Well, because the people who wrote Genesis had more foresight, they knew what exactly happened in between then and when they were living in history. So they could look back, and when God had promised that there would be many great nations. Maybe God did tell him that there would be 12 princes, or maybe he said that many great princes would come. But then we specifically have the people in the future writing Genesis being like, oh, we know that there were 12. But the interesting thing about the number 12 is Israel also had 12 sons. Jacob did. And of course, he may have had more than that, but we know that 12 is essentially the number of great leadership, I guess you could say, the number of fullness and greatness of a people. And again, you don't have to go any further than Israel or Jacob's 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there was also 12 princes of Ishmael. And so we actually have a list later on. And this is why it's so important to remember little facts. Like when you come to Genesis 25, 13 through 16 in the future, you find out their names are Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tema, Yetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. And so there you have 12 leaders of tribes or princes of nations. And so it's ironic that there's a list of 12 that comes in the future. And this is why genealogies and also looking back at hints that come before and learning some context, like, oh, when we talk about Ishmael and we're looking at his genealogy, maybe we should pay attention and look to see if there are 12 leaders or princes or chiefs that come out from this group. And what do you know? This is exactly what happened. And obviously there could have been more than that, but those were either the predominant ones, kind of like the 12 tribes of Israel. Is it possible that Israel had some other factions and some other families that were smaller names? Yeah, that's possible. Except this is the banners that all the groups come under. And also, again, these numbers are special and symbolic in telling the story. And, you know, which one came first? Is it the 12 tribes that inspired 12 being a number symbolizing this thing? Or was 12 already one and God just so happened to line it up? It's good to ask questions, but it's also not helpful to go down so many rabbit trails that you're asking questions that the text isn't even talking about. And so we get close to the end of this passage, and God reemphasizes, but even though I'm going to bless Ishmael, so don't worry, remember, I'm going to establish the covenant with your son, Isaac, who Sarah is going to have. So Hagar isn't going to have a second child with you. There's a high possibility that he became really fond and worked well with Hagar at that point because she was mothering and nurturing and the mother of his child. And it seems as if Sarah was not the one taking care of Ishmael. And originally, I think Sarah thought, you have the baby, I'll take it from here. But it seems pretty clear that that's not what happened. And that's what caused all of that tension. And of course, that was wrong for Sarah to think that in the first place. And it was wrong for Abraham to just let it all play out and just be like, well, my hands are tied. You guys do what you need to do. You tell me what you want done. And, God is pulling Abraham back to the original intentions. And that's for him to give a son to him and his wife, the original and potentially only legitimate woman that he can or should be having his future descendant with. So, with that said, God tells them that they're going to have the child by whatever time it was then that next year. And so when God was done speaking with and finalizing the details about this covenant, and that the finalization of it is Abraham, you and everyone get circumcised, and also, hey, get on it because you're going to have a child with your wife, Sarah, in a year. That's when everything was tied up with this covenant. All the details were secured. And so now that that's where God left off, that's where we're going to leave off until the next part of the story, where Abraham ends up following up with the covenant and what they just talked about. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.